Sometimes a single act of kindness can change two lives forever. Sometimes the person you save becomes the one who saves you. Jeb Sawyer had nothing but a broken-down mule and a heart too big for his own good. When he saw a woman in a torn wedding dress tied to a wagon wheel outside the saloon, he knew he had to help. She'd been sold twice over by a drunken trader, first as a mail-order bride, then as property to settle debts. Jeb cut her free and gave her his only blanket. The woman, Elena, stood tall and said something that would change everything. What she revealed about herself next would transform not just Jeb's life, but the entire town. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Clearwater Pass as Jeb Sawyer made his way toward the general store, his worn boots scuffing against the packed earth. His mule, Bessie, plodded along behind him, her ears twitching at the familiar sounds of the waking town. Jeb had been making this same journey every Tuesday for the past 3 years, ever since he'd settled in this remote corner of Colorado territory, and the routine brought him a measure of peace that had been hard to find in his younger days. At 28, Jeb possessed the weathered hands and sun-creased face of a man who'd spent his life working the land, but his eyes held a gentleness that spoke of something deeper than mere survival. His father had always said that a man's true measure wasn't in what he owned, but in how he treated those who had nothing to offer him in return. Those words had been carved into Jeb's heart as surely as they'd been etched into the wooden cross that marked his father's grave on the hill behind his cabin. The cabin itself was nothing to boast about, a simple structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney that leaked smoke when the wind blew from the east. The roof needed patching, and the single window faced west, catching the last light of each day in a way that made even the humble interior seem touched by gold. It was here that Jeb kept his most treasured possession, his father's worn Bible, its leather cover soft from years of handling, its pages filled with careful notations in his father's steady script. Thomas Sawyer had been a circuit preacher before settling down to farm, and he'd raised his son with stories of compassion and redemption that had taken root in Jeb's soul like seeds in fertile ground. Every soul you meet is carrying a burden you can't see. His father used to say while they worked side by side in their small vegetable garden, "Your job isn't to judge that burden, it's to help carry it when you can." Now, as Jeb tied Bessie to the hitching post outside Murphy's General Store, he reflected on how those words had guided him through the hardest years of his life. After his father's death, he'd wandered for a time, working cattle drives and mining claims, searching for something he couldn't name. It was only when he'd found this piece of land, 20 acres of scrub brush and possibility, that he'd felt the restless ache in his chest begin to settle. The land wasn't much, but it was his. He'd built the cabin with his own hands, planted a garden that yielded enough vegetables to trade for supplies, and slowly earned the respect of his neighbors through quiet acts of kindness. When the Hendersons' barn burned down, Jeb had been the first to arrive with lumber and willing hands. When old Mrs. Patterson took sick, he'd chopped enough firewood to last her through the winter. He never asked for payment, and he never expected gratitude. He simply did what his father had taught him was right. Clearwater Pass was the kind of town that attracted people running from something or towards something, rarely anything in between. The main street stretched maybe 300 yards from the church at one end to the cemetery at the other, with a handful of businesses squeezed in between. Murphy's store, the Dusty Rose Saloon, the blacksmith shop, and the small office that served as both post office and occasional courthouse when the circuit judge made his rounds. The saloon was where most of the town's troubles started and ended, presided over by a man named Samuel Briggs, who'd arrived in Clearwater Pass about 2 years ago with a wagon full of whiskey and a mouth full of promises. Briggs claimed to be a trader, buying and selling goods between the mining camps and the railroad towns, but most folks suspected his real business was considerably less legitimate. He had the smooth tongue of a man accustomed to talking his way out of trouble, and the cold eyes of someone who'd caused plenty of it. Jeb had crossed paths with Briggs only a few times, and each encounter had left him with an uneasy feeling that lingered like the taste of bad coffee. There was something about the man's smile that never quite reached his eyes, and the way he looked at people, especially women, that made Jeb's skin crawl. But Briggs kept his activities mostly to himself, and the town's unofficial policy was to mind your own business as long as it didn't spill over into theirs. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Jeb purchased his usual supplies: flour, salt, coffee, and a few strips of jerky for the ride home, and spent a few minutes chatting with Murphy about the weather and the prospects for the coming harvest. Murphy was a good man, honest in his dealings and fair in his prices, and Jeb had grown to value their brief conversations as much as he did the goods he purchased. "You hear about the commotion over at the saloon yesterday?" Murphy asked, as he wrapped Jeb's purchases in brown paper. Jeb shook his head. "I don't make it a habit to keep track of saloon business." "Well, this might be different," Murphy said, lowering his voice. Briggs came back from one of his trading runs with a woman. Young thing, all dressed up in white, like she was heading to a wedding. But something wasn't right about it. She looked scared, and Briggs was treating her rough. A familiar tightness settled in Jeb's chest. "What kind of rough?" "The kind that makes decent folks look the other way," Murphy replied grimly. "Sheriff's been out of town for a week, and ain't nobody else wants to tangle with Briggs and his men. But it ain't sitting right with me, I'll tell you that." Jeb nodded slowly, his father's words echoing in his mind. "Every soul you meet is carrying a burden you can't see." He thanked Murphy, loaded his supplies onto Bessie, and headed for home. But the conversation nagged at him, like a splinter under the skin. The ride back to his cabin usually took about an hour, following a winding trail that skirted the edge of the foothills and offered spectacular views of the valley below. But today, Jeb found himself taking the longer route that led past the saloon, telling himself he was just curious about what Murphy had mentioned. The truth was, he couldn't shake the image of a frightened woman in a wedding dress, and his conscience wouldn't let him simply ride away. What he saw when he rounded the bend stopped him cold. There, tied to a wagon wheel beside the saloon's back entrance, was a woman in what had once been a beautiful white dress. The fabric was torn and stained with dust and something that looked like dried blood, and her dark hair had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been in, falling around her shoulders in tangled waves. But it was her eyes that hit him like a physical blow. They were the deep brown of rich earth, and they held a mixture of fear and fury that spoke of someone who'd been pushed to the very edge of endurance. She wasn't crying or pleading, she was simply sitting there with her hands bound behind her back, watching the world with the alertness of a cornered animal. Jeb dismounted slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd seen plenty of hard things in his life, but something about this scene struck him as particularly wrong. The woman looked up as he approached, and he saw her body tense, ready to fight or flee despite her bonds. "Ma'am," he said quietly, keeping his voice as gentle as he could manage. "Are you all right?" She studied his face for a long moment before answering. "Do I look all right to you?" The question was fair enough, and Jeb felt his cheeks warm with embarrassment. "No, ma'am, you don't. Can I help you somehow?" "You can cut me loose," she said without hesitation, "unless you're one of Briggs's men, in which case you can go straight to hell." Despite the circumstances, Jeb found himself fighting back a smile. This woman had fire in her, even tied up and abandoned. "I'm not one of Briggs' men," he assured her, pulling out his knife. "Name's Jeb Sawyer, and I'm going to cut these ropes now." She watched him work, and he could feel her tension gradually ease as she realized he meant no harm. The ropes were thick and had been tied cruelly tight, cutting into her wrists and leaving angry red marks on her skin. When the last strand parted, she brought her hands around to her front and rubbed at the rope burns, wincing at the pain. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'm Elena." "Pleased to meet you, Elena," Jeb replied, though the circumstances were far from pleasant. "Mind if I ask how you came to be tied up out here?" Her jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought she might not answer. Then she sighed, and the sound held all the weariness of someone who'd been carrying too heavy a load for too long. "I was supposed to be married," she said. "Came out here from Boston to marry a man I'd never met, a rancher named William Carson. But when I got to the train station, Briggs was there instead. Said Carson had changed his mind and sold his claim on me to settle a debt." She laughed bitterly. "Turned out Carson never existed. The whole thing was a setup to get me out here where nobody would ask questions." Jeb felt anger rising in his chest like a tide of molten metal. "That's about the lowest thing I've ever heard." "It gets worse," Elena continued. "Briggs decided I was too much trouble to keep around, so he sold me again, this time to a mining camp up north. I was supposed to be shipped out this morning, but I fought back, and he left me here to think about my attitude." The casual way she spoke about such horrors made Jeb's hands clench into fists. "Well, you're not going to any mining camp," he said firmly. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Elena looked at him with something that might have been hope, but caution tempered it. "You don't know what you're getting into, Jeb Sawyer. Briggs has men, and they're not particular about how they handle problems." "Neither am I," Jeb said, surprising himself with the steel in his voice. "Come on, let's get you somewhere safe." He helped her to her feet, noticing how she swayed slightly before steadying herself. Whatever she'd been through, it had taken its toll. Without a word, he untied his bedroll from behind his saddle and wrapped it around her shoulders like a shawl. "You don't have to do this," Elena said softly. "I'm nothing to you." Jeb met her eyes, and in them he saw something that reminded him of his father's words about souls carrying invisible burdens. "My father always said that helping strangers was just helping family you hadn't met yet," he said. "Besides, looks to me like you could use a friend." For the first time since he'd found her, Elena smiled. It transformed her face completely, chasing away the fear and replacing it with something that looked like hope. "I could use a friend," she agreed. As they prepared to leave, Jeb found himself wondering what exactly he'd gotten himself into. But as he looked at Elena's grateful face, he knew he'd made the right choice. His father would have been proud. The ride to Jeb's cabin passed mostly in silence, broken only by the steady clip-clop of Bessie's hooves and the occasional creak of leather. Elena rode behind him on the mule, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance, and he could feel the tension in her body gradually begin to ease as they put distance between themselves and the town. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded Jeb why he'd fallen in love with this land in the first place. His cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, with a vegetable garden that was his pride and joy, and a small corral where Bessie spent her nights. It wasn't much to look at, but it was honest work and honest living, and Jeb had never wanted more than that. As they approached, he found himself seeing it through Elena's eyes and wondering what a woman from Boston would make of his simple home. "It's peaceful," Elena said as he helped her down from the mule, and he was relieved to hear genuine appreciation in her voice, rather than polite disappointment. "Gets lonely sometimes," Jeb admitted, "but it suits me." He led her inside, grateful that he'd taken the time to straighten up that morning. The cabin's single room served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom all in one, with his narrow bed in one corner and a small table with 2 chairs near the fireplace. His father's Bible sat on a shelf above the mantel, surrounded by a few other treasured books and the carved wooden cross his father had made with his own hands. Elena moved slowly around the room, taking in the details with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to take safety for granted. When she reached the fireplace, she paused to study a daguerreotype of Jeb with an older man who bore a strong resemblance to him. "Your father?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Thomas Sawyer. He passed 3 years ago, come October. He looks like he was a kind man." "The kindest I ever knew," Jeb said simply. "Are you hungry? I've got some beans and cornbread, nothing fancy, but it'll fill you up." As he busied himself preparing a simple meal, Elena settled at the table, and for the first time since he'd found her, she seemed to truly relax. The firelight caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, and he noticed that despite everything she'd been through, She carried herself with a dignity that spoke of good breeding and education. "Jeb," she said quietly as he ladled beans into 2 bowls, "I need to tell you something important, something that changes everything." He set the bowls on the table and took the chair across from her. "I'm listening." Elena reached into the bodice of her torn dress and withdrew a small object wrapped in oiled cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing what appeared to be some kind of official document bearing several impressive-looking seals. "I wasn't entirely truthful about who I am," she began, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. "My name is Elena Whitmore, and I am indeed from Boston. But I didn't come west to be a mail-order bride. I came here because I had to run." Jeb waited patiently, sensing that whatever she was about to tell him required all the courage she could muster. "I'm a doctor," she said simply, and the words hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious. For a moment, Jeb wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "A doctor? I graduated from the Boston University School of Medicine 2 years ago. I was one of only 3 women in my class, and the only one who completed the full program." She smoothed the document with careful fingers. "This is my medical certificate. It's the only proof I have of who I really am." Jeb stared at the document, trying to process what she was telling him. He'd heard of women doctors, of course, but he'd never met one. The idea seemed both wonderful and terrifying, like something from a fairy tale. "Why did you have to run?" he asked gently. Elena's face darkened. "Because there are men back east who believe women have no business practicing medicine. Men with money and influence who were determined to see me fail. When I wouldn't be discouraged, they became more direct in their methods." Before she could continue, the sound of approaching horses cut through the evening air. Jeb rose quickly and moved to the window, peering out through the gathering dusk. 3 riders were approaching the cabin at a fast pace, and even in the fading light he could make out the hulking form of Samuel Briggs in the lead. "They found us," Elena whispered, her face pale. Jeb's mind raced. His nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and there was no law in Clearwater Pass that would stand up to Briggs and his men. But as he looked at Elena, remarkable woman who'd survived deception and bondage only to trust him with her secret, she knew he couldn't let them take her. "Get behind the bed," he said quietly. "Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe. Jeb, you can't fight 3 men." "I'm not going to fight them," he said, though his hand moved instinctively to the rifle hanging above the door. "I'm going to talk to them, but I need you hidden just in case talking doesn't work." Elena squeezed his hand briefly before moving to the back of the cabin. Jeb took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to his father's memory, and stepped outside to meet his visitors. Briggs reined in his horse just a few feet from the cabin steps, close enough that Jeb could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the ugly satisfaction in his eyes. The 2 men flanking him were strangers, but they had the hard look of men who made their living through violence. "Evening, Sawyer," Briggs said with false friendliness. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Can't think what that might be," Jeb replied evenly. Briggs laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Don't play dumb with me, boy. I know you took the woman. She's my property, bought and paid for, and I want her back." "No person can be property," Jeb said, his voice carrying more authority than he felt. "Not in this territory, not anywhere." "Is that so?" Briggs dismounted slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Well, I've got papers that say different, and I've got men who'll help me collect what's mine." "Your papers are fake, and your claim is worthless," Jeb said. "The woman is under my protection now." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Briggs. He'd never thought of himself as the kind of man who made dramatic declarations, but something about Elena's courage had awakened something fierce and protective in his chest. "Your protection," Briggs sneered. "You're a dirt farmer with a broken-down mule and delusions of grandeur. What kind of protection could you possibly offer?" "The kind that comes from knowing right from wrong," Jeb said simply. For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other across the growing darkness. Then Briggs nodded to his companions, and Jeb tensed for whatever was coming next. But instead of violence, the sound that broke the tension was unexpected, the thin, desperate wail of a child in distress. It came from the direction of the Henderson place, carrying clearly on the still evening air. "That's little Mary Henderson," Jeb said, recognizing the sound. "Something's wrong." Even Briggs hesitated at the sound. Whatever else he wasn't completely without human feeling, and the cry of a sick child was something that reached past all other considerations. Elena appeared in the doorway of the cabin, her medical certificate still clutched in her hand. "A child is sick," she said, addressing all of them but looking directly at Jeb. "I can help." "Elena, no," Jeb started to say, but she was already moving toward Bessie. "I'm a doctor," she announced to the assembled men, her voice ringing with authority. "That child needs medical attention, and I'm the only one here qualified to provide it." Briggs stared at her in amazement. "A woman doctor? That's the biggest load of—" "Mr. Briggs," Elena interrupted, her voice cutting through his protest like a blade. "You can continue this ridiculous charade, or you can help me save a child's life. What's it going to be?" The sound of crying grew more desperate, and Jeb saw something shift in Briggs's expression. Whatever crimes he might be guilty of, the sound of a suffering child seemed to reach something human in him. "This ain't over, Sawyer," Briggs said finally, swinging back onto his horse, "but I reckon even a fake doctor is better than no doctor when it comes to a sick young'un." As the men rode toward the Henderson place, Elena looked at Jeb with eyes that held both fear and determination. "Are you ready to see what a real doctor can do?" she asked. Jeb nodded, though his heart was still hammering from the confrontation. "Lead the way, Doc." As they hurried toward the sound of distress, Jeb realized that everything had changed in the space of a few minutes. Elena had revealed her true nature, claimed her identity as a physician, and challenged the most dangerous man in the territory to his face. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the simple life he'd known. But as he watched Elena's determined stride and remembered the authority in her voice when she'd spoken about saving a child, he found he didn't want to go back. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something larger than himself, something that mattered. His father would have called it providence. Jeb was beginning to think his father had been right about a lot of things. The Henderson cabin was awash in lamplight when they arrived, and the sounds of distress had grown more urgent. Tom Henderson met them at the door, his face haggard with worry and exhaustion. Behind him, his wife Sarah could be heard murmuring desperate prayers over their 5-year-old daughter Mary. "Doc Patterson's been out of town for near 2 weeks, Tom said without preamble, his words rushing together. "Mary's been burning up with fever for 3 days now, and nothing we do seems to help. She's barely taking water, and Sarah's beside herself with worry." Elena stepped forward with the calm authority that had impressed Jeb earlier. "I'm Dr. Elena Whitmore. May I examine your daughter?" Tom's eyes widened in surprise, but desperation overrode his questions. "A lady doctor? Well, I reckon any doctor's better than none. Come on in." The cabin's interior was stifling with the heat from the fireplace and the close air of sickness. Little Mary lay on a narrow bed, her small face flushed with fever and her breathing rapid and shallow. Sarah Henderson looked up as they entered, her eyes red from crying and sleepless nights. "This is Dr. Whitmore," Tom explained quickly. "She's come to help Mary." Elena knelt beside the bed and placed a gentle hand on the child's forehead. Mary's eyes fluttered open, brilliant blue eyes in a face that should have been bright with childhood mischief, but was instead dulled by illness. "Hello, sweetheart," Elena said softly. "My name is Elena. I'm here to help you feel better." Mary tried to speak, but could only manage a whisper. "Hurts," she said simply. "I know it does," Elena replied, her voice filled with compassion. "Can you show me where it hurts the most?" With obvious effort, Mary pointed to her throat and then to her stomach. Elena nodded and began a careful examination, checking the child's pulse, looking into her throat with the aid of a lamp, and gently feeling her abdomen. Jeb watched in fascination as Elena's entire demeanor changed. Gone was any trace of the frightened woman he'd found tied to a wagon wheel, replaced by a professional whose competence was evident in every movement. Has she been able to keep food down? Elena asked Sarah. Nothing for 2 days, Sarah replied, wringing her hands. Just a little water here and there, and even that sometimes comes back up. Elena reached into the torn bodice of her dress and withdrew a small cloth bag that Jeb hadn't noticed before. From it, she produced several small packets of what appeared to be dried herbs and roots. I always carry a basic medicine kit, she explained to Jeb's questioning look. Force of habit from my training. She opened one of the packets and held it to her nose, inhaling deeply. This is willow bark powder, she said to the anxious parents. It will help bring down her fever. And this, she opened another packet, is ginger root for her stomach. But how do we get her to take it? Sarah asked. She won't keep anything down. We're going to make a very weak tea and give it to her a few drops at a time, Elena explained. Her body can absorb small amounts even when her stomach is upset. Jeb, could you help me heat some water? As Jeb worked to stoke the fire and heat a kettle, he found himself watching Elena with growing admiration. She moved with quiet efficiency, preparing her medicines while keeping up a steady stream of gentle conversation with Mary. The child seemed to respond to Elena's presence, her breathing becoming less labored as the doctor worked. There's something else, Elena said quietly to the parents while the water heated. I believe Mary has what we call quinsea, severe throat infection. It's serious, but treatable if we act quickly. Tom's face went pale. Quinsea killed my brother's boy 2 summers back. Not if it's treated properly, Elena said firmly. I'm going to show you how to care for her, and she's going to get better. But it will take time and patience. For the next hour, Elena worked with the skill and dedication of someone who'd spent years training for exactly this moment. She prepared the willow bark tea and administered it drop by drop, waiting patiently between doses to see how Mary's stomach would handle it. She showed Sarah how to make a poultice for the child's throat and explained the importance of keeping her as comfortable as possible while her body fought the infection. Gradually, Mary's fever began to break. The child's breathing became easier, and she was able to take slightly larger sips of the medicinal tea. Color began to return to her cheeks, and she even managed a small smile when Elena told her a gentle story about a brave little girl who fought off dragons. She's going to be all right, Elena finally announced, and Sarah burst into tears of relief. How can we ever thank you? Tom asked, his voice thick with emotion. Just follow the instructions I've given you, Elena replied. Continue the willow bark tea every few hours, keep the poultice on her throat, and make sure she gets plenty of rest. She should be much better by tomorrow. As they prepared to leave, Tom pressed a small bag of coins into Elena's hand. It ain't much, but it's all we can spare. I can't take payment for helping a sick child, Elena protested. Yes, you can, Tom said firmly. A doctor's work deserves a doctor's pay, whether you're a man or a woman. You saved our little girl's life tonight. The ride back to Jeb's cabin was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Elena sat behind him on Bessie with the exhausted satisfaction of someone who'd done important work well, and Jeb found himself filled with a respect and admiration that went deeper than anything he'd felt for another person in years. That was something to see, he said finally, as they approached his cabin. That was why I became a doctor, Elena replied. Moments like that when you can actually make a difference, when you can ease suffering and save lives, it makes all the struggle worthwhile. Back at the cabin, Jeb busied himself preparing a late supper, while Elena cleaned and reorganized her small medicine kit. He found himself stealing glances at her as she worked, marveling at the transformation he'd witnessed. This was a woman who'd found her calling and pursued it, despite obstacles that would have stopped most people. Elena, he said as they sat down to eat, what you did tonight, that was a miracle. She looked up from her plate with a tired but genuine smile. No, Jeb. That was just medicine. Good medicine, practiced with care and knowledge. The real miracle is that people like Tom and Sarah trust me enough to let me help their child. And why wouldn't they? Jeb asked. You clearly know what you're doing. Elena's expression grew serious. Because I'm a woman in a profession that most people believe should be limited to men. Because there are those who think my education is somehow less valid, my skills somehow inferior, simply because of my gender. Jeb shook his head. Anyone who saw you work tonight would know better. You'd be surprised, Elena said sadly. But thank you for saying so, and thank you for standing up to Briggs earlier. I know that took courage. Jeb felt his cheeks warm with embarrassment. Just did what seemed right. That's what makes it courageous, Elena said softly. As they finished their meal, Jeb found himself thinking about his father's old recipe book, tucked away in a wooden chest with his mother's few remaining possessions. His mother had been a gifted cook and a gentle healer in her own right, using herbs and traditional remedies to help their neighbors through illnesses and injuries. She would have understood and appreciated Elena's calling in a way that few others might. "I've got something I'd like to show you," he said, rising from the table. He retrieved the worn recipe book from the chest and placed it gently in Elena's hands. "This belonged to my mother. She wasn't a trained doctor like you, but she had a gift for healing. These are her recipes for remedies and tonics, things she learned from her mother and grandmother." Elena opened the book carefully, her eyes lighting up as she read the careful notations. "These are wonderful," she said with genuine enthusiasm. "Some of these remedies are very sophisticated. Your mother was clearly a wise woman. She would have liked you," Jeb said simply. "She always said that healing was the most important work a person could do." Elena looked up at him with eyes that held a depth of gratitude he wasn't sure he deserved. "Thank you for sharing this with me. And thank you for everything else, for freeing me, for standing up for me, for believing in me." "Thank you for trusting me," Jeb replied, "and for showing me what real courage looks like." As Elena settled in for the night on a makeshift bed he'd arranged near the fireplace, Jeb lay awake thinking about the extraordinary woman who'd come into his life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. He was certain that Briggs wouldn't give up easily, but tonight had proven that Elena was exactly who she claimed to be. She was a doctor, a healer, someone with the knowledge and skill to make a real difference in the world. And somehow, miraculously, she'd chosen to trust him with her secret and her safety. It was a responsibility he didn't take lightly, and one he was determined to prove worthy of. Word of Mary Henderson's miraculous recovery spread through Clearwater Pass like wildfire. By the time Jeb and Elena made their way to town 3 days later for supplies, a small crowd had gathered outside Murphy's store, and the conversations died to whispers as they approached. Jeb could feel the weight of curious stares and hear fragments of hushed discussions about the lady doctor and that woman who saved the Henderson girl. Elena walked beside him with quiet dignity, her torn wedding dress replaced by a simple brown skirt and white blouse that Sarah Henderson had insisted she take as partial payment. She'd pinned her dark hair back in a practical style, and the medical certificate now rested safely in a leather portfolio that Tom Henderson had crafted for her. To Jeb's eyes, she looked every inch the professional physician she claimed to be. "Dr. Whitmore," a voice called out as they tied Bessie to the hitching post. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow Jeb had helped through the previous winter, was hurrying toward them as fast as her arthritic legs would carry her. "Dr. Whitmore, is it true you're a real doctor? With schooling and everything?" Elena smiled warmly at the older woman. "Yes, ma'am. I graduated from Boston University School of Medicine 2 years ago." "Well, I'll be," Mrs. Patterson breathed. "A lady doctor right here in Clearwater Pass. The Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he?" She leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I don't suppose you know anything about this terrible pain I get in my hands when the weather turns cold." "Arthritis," Elena said without hesitation. "Very common and very treatable. Would you like me to examine your hands?" For the next few minutes, Elena conducted an impromptu examination right there on the street, gently manipulating Mrs. Patterson's swollen joints and asking careful questions about her symptoms. A small crowd gathered to watch, and Jeb was impressed by Elena's patience with their curiosity and her ability to explain medical concepts in terms the townspeople could understand. "I can prepare a willow bark tincture that will help with the pain," Elena told Mrs. Patterson, "and there are exercises you can do to keep your joints flexible. Would you like me to show you?" "Oh yes, please," Mrs. Patterson exclaimed. Old Doc Pattersono relation, mind you. He just told me to live with it, said it was part of getting old. Pain doesn't have to be accepted simply because we age, Elena said firmly. There are ways to manage it and maintain a good quality of life. As Elena demonstrated gentle hand exercises, Jeb noticed that more people were gathering around them. He recognized several faces from the crowd farmers and shopkeepers, mothers with children, even a few of the rougher men who frequented the saloon. Their expressions ranged from curious to skeptical, but none were openly hostile. Mrs. Whitmore, came a hesitant voice from the edge of the crowd. A young woman stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment. I'm Martha Collins. I was wondering, that is, I hope you don't mind me asking, do you know about women's troubles, the kind of things that men doctors don't like to discuss? Elena's expression softened with understanding. I know about all kinds of medical concerns that affect women, Mrs. Collins, and I understand that it can be difficult to discuss such matters with male physicians. Would you like to speak privately? The relief on Martha Collins' face was evident to everyone watching. Oh yes, please. I've been suffering for months, and I just didn't know who to turn to. As Elena arranged to meet with Mrs. Collins privately later that day, Jeb felt a surge of pride and admiration for the woman beside him. She was offering something invaluable to the women of Clearwater Pass Medical Care from someone who truly understood their needs and concerns. But not everyone in the crowd was pleased with what they were witnessing. Jeb caught sight of Samuel Briggs standing in the doorway of the saloon, his face twisted with anger and something that looked like calculation. Two of his men flanked him, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. Quite a show you're putting on there, Doc. Briggs called out, his voice carrying clearly across the street. But I wonder if these good folks know the truth about their new miracle worker. The crowd fell silent, and Jeb felt Elena tense beside him. But when she spoke, her voice was calm and steady. What truth would that be, Mr. Briggs? Briggs stepped into the street, his men following close behind. The truth about why a fancy Boston lady ends up dressed like a bride and shipped west like cargo. The truth about what she's running from back east. I'm not running from anything, Elena said clearly. I came west because I believed there was a need for medical services here. And from what I've seen, I was right. Is that so? Briggs laughed harshly. Well, I've got friends back east, and they tell a different story. They tell me there's folks in Boston who'd be mighty interested to know where Dr. Elena Whitmore ended up. Jeb saw fear flicker in Elena's eyes, but she stood her ground. I have nothing to hide from anyone. We'll see about that, Briggs said with a cruel smile. In the meantime, I think these good people deserve to know that their new doctor is practicing without proper authorization. Far as I know, the territorial government ain't issued no license for lady doctors. Elena reached into her portfolio and withdrew the medical certificate, holding it up for all to see. This document certifies that I am a fully licensed physician, educated at one of the finest medical schools in the country. My credentials are beyond question. Fancy piece of paper, Briggs scoffed. But it don't mean nothing out here. Territorial law says all practicing physicians got to be approved by the Territorial Medical Board. And last time I checked, they ain't too keen on lady doctors. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Jeb could see doubt beginning to creep into some faces. Elena's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, old Doc Patterson pushed through the crowd. He was a grizzled man in his 60s who'd been the territory's only physician for nearly 20 years, and his word carried considerable weight. "Hold on there, Briggs," Doc Patterson said in his gravelly voice. "I've been away tending to a mining accident up north, but I heard about what happened with the Henderson girl. From what Tom tells me, this lady saved his daughter's life with skill and knowledge that would do credit to any physician." He turned to Elena with obvious respect. "Dr. Whitmore, I'd be honored to examine your credentials and vouch for your competence if the Territorial Board has any questions. We need more good doctors out here, not fewer." Elena's relief was visible. "Thank you, Dr. Patterson. I would welcome your endorsement." "As for practicing without authorization," Doc Patterson continued, addressing Briggs directly, "emergency medical care don't require no territorial approval. Never has, never will. When someone's dying, you use whatever help's available. Briggs' face darkened with frustrated anger. "This ain't over," he said to Elena. "I got questions about you, lady, and I aim to get answers." As Briggs and his men retreated to the saloon, the crowd began to disperse, but several people approached Elena to schedule appointments or ask medical questions. Jeb watched with growing amazement as she handled each inquiry with professional competence and genuine compassion. "Dr. Whitmore," came a shy voice. A young mother holding a baby stepped forward. "My little one's been colicky, something fierce. I don't suppose—" "Of course," Elena said immediately. "Colic is very treatable. Why don't you bring him by tomorrow afternoon, and we'll see what we can do to help him feel better." As they finally made their way into Murphy's store for supplies, the shopkeeper greeted them with obvious enthusiasm. "Dr. Whitmore, Tom Henderson was just in here singing your praises. Says you not only saved his little girl, but taught his wife more about caring for sick children than she'd learned in 10 years of mothering. Mary's recovery was the result of proper treatment and excellent nursing care," Elena replied modestly. "Mrs. Henderson is a natural caregiver." Murphy shook his head in wonder. "A lady doctor, right here in Clearwater Pass. Who would have thought? You know, my wife's been having some troubles that she's been too embarrassed to mention to Doc Patterson." "I'd be happy to speak with her," Elena said warmly. "Women's health concerns are an important part of my practice." As they gathered their supplies, Jeb found himself marveling at the transformation taking place. In the space of a few days, Elena had gone from being Briggs's captive to becoming a respected member of the community. Her medical skills were genuine, her compassion was evident, and her presence was already making a difference in people's lives. But Briggs' threats still echoed in his mind. The man clearly had no intention of giving up his claim on Elena, and his mention of friends back east suggested that Elena's past might not be as settled as she'd hoped. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace in his cabin, Jeb watched Elena carefully updating her medical notes in a leather-bound journal. Her concentration was complete, her handwriting precise and professional. "Elena," he said quietly, "what Briggs said today about people back east, is there truth to that?" She looked up from her writing, and he saw shadows of old pain in her eyes. "There's always truth mixed in with Samuel Briggs' lies," she said finally. "That's what makes him dangerous. Do you want to tell me about it?" Elena set down her pen and was quiet for a long moment. "My father was also a physician," she said finally. "He believed, as I do, that medicine should be about healing, not profit. He treated patients regardless of their ability to pay, and he taught me that a doctor's first duty is to the sick, not to the wealthy." "That sounds like a good man," Jeb said gently. "He was," Elena agreed, her voice thick with emotion. "And there were those in Boston's medical establishment who saw his principles as a threat to their way of doing business. When he died suddenly last year, officially, of a heart attack, I began asking questions about his death, questions that made some very powerful people very uncomfortable." Jeb felt a chill run down his spine. "You think he was murdered?" "I think my father knew something that someone wanted to keep quiet," Elena said carefully. "And I think they're afraid I might know it too." "Is that why you really came west?" Elena nodded slowly. "I received some very clear warnings that my health and safety couldn't be guaranteed if I remained in Boston. The mail-order bride scheme was supposed to be my cover-away to disappear into a new identity where no one would think to look for Dr. Elena Whitmore. But Briggs has figured out who you are." "Briggs has figured out enough to be dangerous," Elena corrected. "The question is what he plans to do with that knowledge." Jeb reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Whatever he plans, he'll have to go through me first." Elena turned her hand palm up and squeezed his fingers. "I've brought danger into your life, Jeb. I never intended for that to happen." "You've brought purpose into my life," Jeb corrected. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm part of something that matters. Even if it gets us both killed?" Jeb thought of his father's words about helping carry invisible burdens and smiled. Especially then. The following morning brought an unwelcome visitor to Jeb's door. Claude Morrison, Clearwater Pass's self-appointed mayor and the owner of the largest mercantile business in town. stood on the cabin's threshold with an official-looking document in his hand and an expression of barely concealed hostility on his face. "Sawyer," Morrison said without preamble, "we need to talk about your property situation." Jeb stepped outside, closing the door behind him to give Elena privacy as she prepared for the day's medical appointments. Morrison was a thin, nervous man who'd arrived in Clearwater Pass about the same time as Briggs, and Jeb had always suspected the two were more closely connected than either cared to admit. "What about my property?" Jeb asked evenly. Morrison unfolded the document with theatrical flourish. "According to this notice of outstanding debt, you owe the territorial government $700 in back taxes and fees. Payment is due immediately, or the territory will seize your land for public auction." Jeb stared at the paper in disbelief. "That's impossible. I've paid every tax and fee required. I've got receipts going back 3 years." "Well, apparently your records don't match the territorial records," Morrison said with false sympathy. "Could be a clerical error, of course, but until it's sorted out, the debt stands." "Let me see that," Jeb said, reaching for the document. Morrison pulled it back slightly. "Now, I'm not unreasonable, Sawyer. I understand you're a hard-working man who's fallen on difficult times. And I hear you've been harboring that woman doctor, which is generous of you, but expensive too, I imagine. Get to the point, Morrison. The point is, I might be willing to help you out of this predicament. Pay off your debt to the territory, maybe even throw in a little extra to help you get back on your feet. All you'd have to do is convince the lady doctor that Clearwater Pass isn't the right place for her particular talents." Jeb felt anger rise in his chest like a flame catching dry tinder. "You want me to run Elena out of town? I want you to help her understand that she'd be happier somewhere else." Morrison corrected smoothly. "Somewhere with more opportunities for someone of her education and refinement. This is rough country, Sawyer. Not really suitable for a delicate Boston lady." "Elena can take care of herself," Jeb said firmly. "And she's doing good work here. People need her services." Morrison's expression hardened. "What people need is stability and order. This woman is causing disruption, raising questions about established authority. That's not good for business, and it's not good for the community." "What's not good for the community is corruption," Jeb shot back. "And I'm starting to think you know more about that than you're letting on." Before Morrison could respond, the cabin door opened and Elena emerged, carrying her medical bag and wearing the calm, professional expression that had become familiar to Jeb over the past weeks. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she said pleasantly. "I hope you're feeling well today." Morrison's face flushed slightly. "Dr. Whitmore, I was just discussing some business matters with Sawyer here." "I couldn't help but overhear," Elena said, moving to stand beside Jeb. "Something about territorial records and back taxes. That sounds like exactly the kind of documentation that should be easily verified." "Well, yes, of course, but the territorial offices are quite a distance away." "Not so far that the records couldn't be examined," Elena interrupted smoothly. "In fact, I believe there's a territorial representative who visits the county seat monthly. It would be a simple matter to check the authenticity of any official documents." Morrison's discomfort was becoming increasingly obvious. "That's really not necessary. I'm sure we can work something out among ourselves." Elena reached into her medical bag and withdrew a different document entirely, a folded paper that Jeb didn't recognize. "Speaking of territorial records, I've been doing some research of my own. Did you know that according to the original town charter, filed with the territorial government in 1873, Clearwater Pass was supposed to be governed by an elected council, not a self-appointed mayor?" Morrison's face went pale. "Where did you get that?" "From the Territorial Records Office," Elena said calmly. "Amazing what you can discover when you know where to look and what questions to ask. It seems there are quite a few discrepancies between how this town is currently being run and what the law actually requires." Jeb stared at Elena in amazement. When had she had time to research territorial records? And more importantly, how had she known to look for such specific information? "Now see here," Morrison sputtered. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but..." I think I've discovered that the current leadership of Clearwater Pass has no more legal authority than I do, Elena said with devastating calm, which makes me wonder about the legitimacy of tax assessments, debt notices, and other official-looking documents that might be circulating around town. Morrison looked from Elena to Jeb and back again, clearly struggling to find a response. Finally, he folded the debt notice and stuffed it back into his coat pocket. "This conversation isn't over," he said, trying to salvage some dignity from the encounter. "No," Elena agreed pleasantly. "I don't imagine it is. But the next time we continue it, I suggest you bring properly authenticated documents and legitimate legal authority. Otherwise, you're just a man with a piece of paper making threats he can't back up." Morrison stomped away toward town, his back rigid with frustrated anger. When he was out of earshot, Jeb turned to Elena with undisguised admiration. "Where did you really get that town charter?" Elena smiled mysteriously. "From Mrs. Patterson's attic, actually. She mentioned that her late husband had been involved in the town's founding, and she offered to let me look through his papers. Turns out he kept copies of all the original documents. And you just happened to think to look for them. I learned a long time ago that knowledge is the best weapon against corruption," Elena said. "Men like Morrison and Briggs rely on people not knowing their rights or not understanding how the system is supposed to work. But I've made it my business to understand exactly how things should work." Jeb shook his head in wonder. "Is there anything you don't know how to do?" "I'm still learning," Elena said with a smile, "but I had an excellent teacher. My father always said that a person who wants to help others needs to understand not just medicine, but law, politics, and human nature. He taught me to research everything, question authority, and never accept simple answers to complex problems." As they walked toward town together, Elena had several patients to see, including a follow-up visit with little Mary Henderson. Jeb found himself thinking about the document Elena had produced so effortlessly. His own property deed was locked in a wooden chest back at the cabin, along with his parents' marriage certificate and a few other important papers. But he'd never thought to question whether local authorities had the right to make the demands they made. "Elena," he said as they approached the main street, "the debt notice Morrison showed me, could it be fake?" "Almost certainly," Elena replied without hesitation. "The territorial government doesn't send collection notices through local merchants. They use official territorial marshals for tax collection, and they follow very specific legal procedures." "Then Morrison was trying to steal my land." "Morrison was trying to pressure you into betraying me," Elena corrected. "The land theft was just the method. The real goal was to get rid of the inconvenient woman doctor who's been asking too many questions and treating people who can't afford to pay." They paused at the corner of Main Street, and Jeb could see the bustling activity of a town going about its daily business. But now he was looking at it with different eyes, seeing the undercurrents of power and control that Elena had helped him recognize. "There's something else," Elena said quietly. "Mrs. Patterson told me some interesting things about how Briggs and Morrison arrived in town. Apparently, they came within a few weeks of each other, and they both seemed to have more money than their supposed businesses would explain." "You think they're working together?" "I think they're part of something larger," Elena said carefully. "And I think my presence here is threatening plans that go beyond just running a saloon and a store." "What kind of plans?" Elena was quiet for a moment, watching the people moving through the street. The kind that require keeping people ignorant, dependent, and afraid to ask questions. The kind that fall apart when someone shows up who knows how to read legal documents and isn't intimidated by false authority. Like a doctor from Boston who's been taught to question everything. "Exactly," Elena said with a grim smile. "Which is why they're going to keep escalating their efforts to get rid of me. This morning's visit was just the beginning." As if summoned by her words, Samuel Briggs emerged from the saloon and began walking in their direction, his expression dark with purpose. Jeb automatically moved closer to Elena, his hand brushing against the gun he'd taken to wearing since the confrontation at his cabin. "Dr. Whitmore," Briggs called out when he was still 20 feet away, "I've got some news that might interest you." Elena stood her ground, but Jeb could feel the tension in her body. What news would that be, Mr. Briggs? Got a telegram yesterday from some friends of mine back east, Briggs said with obvious satisfaction. Seems there's folks in Boston who'd be mighty pleased to know where you ended up, folks with badges and warrants. Is that so? Elena's voice remained steady, but Jeb caught the slight tremor in her hands. That's so, Briggs confirmed. Course, it'd be a shame for such a helpful lady doctor to get dragged back east to face whatever troubles she left behind. Especially when she's been doing such good work here. What do you want, Briggs? Jeb said bluntly. Briggs smiled, but it was the cold smile of a predator. Just want to make sure the good doctor understands her situation. She's built herself a nice little practice here, got the respect of the community. Be a real shame if all that disappeared because of some unfortunate legal complications. Are you threatening me, Mr. Briggs? Elena asked calmly. I'm offering you a choice, Briggs replied. You can continue practicing medicine here under my protection, or you can take your chances with whatever's waiting for you back in Boston. But protection costs money, Doc, and the price just went up. Elena's refusal to be intimidated by Briggs's threats only seemed to fuel his determination to control or destroy her. Over the following weeks, a pattern of harassment emerged that was subtle enough to avoid open confrontation but persistent enough to make daily life increasingly difficult. Supplies ordered for Elena's medical practice would mysteriously fail to arrive or would be damaged in transit. Patients who had scheduled appointments would receive visits from Briggs's men, suggesting that perhaps they should reconsider seeking treatment from an unqualified woman doctor. But Elena was not easily discouraged. For every obstacle placed in her path, she found a way around it. When her medical supplies were sabotaged, she began making her own remedies from wild herbs and plants, using knowledge gleaned from both her formal education and Jeb's mother's recipe book. When patients were intimidated, she began making house calls at unusual hours, traveling the back trails and mountain paths that Jeb knew better than any road. It was during one of these clandestine medical visits that Elena made a discovery that would change everything. Mrs. Rebecca Walsh lived in a small cabin, about 5 miles north of town, with her 3 young children. Her husband had died in a mining accident the previous winter, leaving her to struggle with poverty and the endless challenges of raising children alone. She'd sent word to Elena through Mrs. Patterson, asking for help with her youngest child, who had been suffering from persistent stomach troubles. Elena and Jeb made the journey on a grey October afternoon, following deer trails and ranch roads, to avoid being seen by anyone who might report their movements to Briggs. The Walsh cabin was even more humble than Jeb's, with a leaking roof and gaps between the logs that would make the coming winter particularly harsh. Rebecca Walsh was a woman of perhaps 30, but hardship had aged her beyond her years. She greeted them with the grateful relief of someone who had been carrying too heavy a burden for too long. "Dr. Whitmore, thank you for coming," she said, ushering them inside. "I know it's dangerous for you to be seen helping folks like me." "It's dangerous for me not to help people who need medical care," Elena replied firmly. "That's exactly the opposite of why I became a doctor." The examination of young Timothy Walsh revealed a fairly simple case of dietary deficiency. The family had been surviving on little more than beans and cornbread for months, and the child's digestive system was suffering from the lack of variety and nutrition. Elena prescribed a series of herbal supplements and gave Rebecca detailed instructions for improving the family's diet within their limited means. As Elena worked, Jeb found himself talking with Rebecca about the challenges of survival in the territory. She was an intelligent woman who'd been a school teacher before her marriage, and she had insights into the community dynamics that surprised him. "Things have gotten worse since Briggs came to town," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure her children couldn't overhear. "Before he arrived, we had problems, sure, but people helped each other. Now there's this feeling that you can't trust anyone, that someone's always watching and reporting back." "Reporting what?" Jeb asked. "Who's talking to who? Who's helping who? Who might be causing trouble for the wrong people?" Rebecca's voice dropped to a whisper. "My husband wasn't killed in no mining accident, Mr. Sawyer. He was murdered because he found something he wasn't supposed to find." Elena looked up sharply from her medical bag. "What kind of something?" Rebecca hesitated, clearly struggling with whether to reveal what she knew. Finally, she went to a wooden chest in the corner of the room and withdrew a folded paper that had been hidden beneath some clothes. "Michael found this in one of the abandoned mine shafts up in Devil's Canyon," she said, handing the document to Elena. "He brought it home the night before he died, said it proved that some powerful folks had been cheating miners out of their rightful claims." Elena unfolded the paper carefully, and Jeb saw her eyes widen as she read. "This is a territorial survey map," she said slowly. "It shows mineral deposits and mining claims throughout the region." "What's unusual about that?" Jeb asked. "What's unusual is that according to this map, half the mining claims in the area belong to someone named Harassment Enterprises, based out of Denver. But the local records show those same claims belonging to various individual miners." Rebecca nodded grimly. "Michael said there were dozens of documents like that hidden in the mine shaft, all showing that what people thought they owned really belonged to this Harrison company." "So someone's been filing false claims with the territorial government," Elena said, her voice tight with anger, "stealing land and mineral rights by creating fake ownership documents. Michael was going to take what he'd found to the territorial capital," Rebecca continued. "He was going to report the whole scheme to the authorities. The next morning, they found him at the bottom of a mine shaft with his neck broke. Called it an accident, said he must have slipped in the dark." Jeb felt sick to his stomach. "And you think Briggs killed him?" "I think Briggs works for whoever's behind the land theft," Rebecca said. "And I think that whoever killed my husband won't hesitate to kill anyone else who gets in their way." Elena studied the survey map intently, her mind clearly working through the implications. "Rebecca, did your husband say exactly where he found these documents?" "Devil's Canyon, about 3 miles up the old logging trail. There's a mine shaft that was supposed to be played out, but Michael said it looked like someone had been using it as a hiding place." "We need to see those documents," Elena said decisively. "Elena, no," Jeb protested. "If this got Michael Walsh killed, it's too dangerous. If this is what I think it is, then it's too dangerous not to investigate," Elena replied. "Don't you see? This explains everything why Briggs and Morrison arrived in town at the same time, why they seem to have more money than their businesses would generate, why they're so determined to control who asks questions and who gets to stay in the community." She turned back to Rebecca. "Has anyone else seen this map?" "Just you and Mr. Sawyer. I haven't dared show it to anyone else." "Keep it that way for now," Elena advised. "But don't destroy it. This could be the key to exposing the whole conspiracy." As they prepared to leave the Walsh cabin, Elena was unusually quiet, clearly lost in thought. It wasn't until they were well away from the house that she spoke again. "Jeb, I need to tell you something I should have told you before." He felt a familiar tightness in his chest. "What is it?" "My father's death in Boston, it wasn't because of his progressive medical practices. It was because he'd discovered a land fraud scheme very similar to what we just learned about here." Jeb pulled Bessie to a halt in the middle of the trail. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that whoever killed my father might be connected to whoever's behind the Harrison Enterprises scheme, and that my coming to Clearwater Pass might not have been the coincidence I thought it was." "You think someone deliberately sent you here?" Elena's face was pale but determined. "I think someone wanted to get rid of Dr. Elena Whitmore, and they didn't much care whether that happened through marriage to a fictional rancher, sale to a mining camp, or murder in a remote territorial town. But what they didn't count on was my finding evidence of their other criminal activities." "Or you're finding someone willing to help you fight back," Jeb added. "Or that," Elena agreed with a small smile. "But Jeb, you need to understand what this means. If I'm right about the connection between my father's death and what's happening here, then we're not just fighting local corruption. We're fighting people with resources and connections that stretch all the way back to Boston." Jeb was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications of what she'd told him. Then he reached over and took her hand. "Elena, do you remember what you said to me the day I found you tied to that wagon wheel? I said you saved me, and that I would save you." "That's right. And I'm holding you to that promise. We're going to save each other, and we're going to save this town from whoever's trying to steal it. But we're going to do it together." Elena squeezed his hand tightly. "Together," she agreed. As they rode back toward his cabin in the gathering dusk, Jeb found himself thinking about how much his life had changed since that morning he decided to take the long way home past the saloon. He'd been living a simple, quiet existence, bothering no one and bothered by no one. Now he was apparently at war with a criminal conspiracy that reached from the Colorado Territory all the way to Massachusetts. But as he looked at the woman riding beside him, this remarkable person who'd brought purpose and meaning into his world, he knew he wouldn't change a thing. Some fights were worth having, and some people were worth fighting for. Elena Whitmore was definitely worth fighting for. The stranger arrived in Clearwater Pass on a cold November morning, riding a fine bay gelding and wearing the kind of expensive clothes that marked him as a man of substance from back east. He was tall and distinguished, with graying hair at his temples and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having his wishes obeyed without question. When he dismounted outside the Dusty Rose saloon and asked for directions to find Dr. Elena Whitmore, half the town seemed to stop what they were doing to stare. Jeb was in Murphy's store when word reached him that a well-dressed stranger was asking questions about Elena. His blood ran cold as he remembered Briggs's threats about friends back east with badges and warrants. He abandoned his purchases and hurried toward his cabin, hoping to warn Elena before the stranger could find her. But he was too late. As he approached the clearing around his home, he could see Elena standing in front of the cabin, talking to the man. Even from a distance, Jeb could read the tension in her posture and the way she seemed to be backing toward the door. "Elena!" he called out as he approached, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his gun. The stranger turned at the sound of his voice, and Jeb was surprised to see that his expression wasn't threatening or hostile. Instead, the man looked relieved, as if he'd been genuinely worried about Elena's safety. "You must be Mr. Sawyer," the stranger said in a cultured Boston accent. "I've heard a great deal about you from our mutual friend here." "I wouldn't call us friends," Elena said quietly, but there was something in her voice that Jeb couldn't quite identify. Not fear, exactly, but something more complex. "Elena, who is this man?" Jeb asked, positioning himself between her and the stranger. "This is Dr. Jonathan Harrington," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral. "My former fiancé." The words hit Jeb like a physical blow. He'd known that Elena had a past, of course, but hearing about a fiancé, especially one who'd tracked her all the way to Colorado Territory, was something he hadn't prepared himself for. "Doctor." Harrington stepped forward with his hand extended. "Mr. Sawyer, I want to thank you for taking care of Elena. When she disappeared from Boston so suddenly, we were all quite concerned for her safety." Jeb shook the offered hand automatically, but his attention was focused on Elena. "You were engaged?" "It was arranged by our families," Elena said quickly. "A business arrangement disguised as a romance. I broke the engagement before I left Boston, because she'd gotten some foolish notions about her father's death." "Dr." Harrington said with what sounded like affectionate exasperation. "Elena always was too imaginative for her own good." "There was nothing foolish about my concerns," Elena said, her voice gaining strength. "And there was nothing imaginary about the threats I received." Dr. Harrington sighed deeply. "My dear Elena, I know you miss your father terribly. We all do. Dr. Whitmore was a brilliant physician and a good man. But his death was a tragedy, not a conspiracy." "Then explain this," Elena said, reaching into a medical bag and withdrawing a folded letter that Jeb had never seen before. "This arrived the day before my father died. Read it aloud, Jonathan." Dr. Harrington took the letter reluctantly and unfolded it. As he read, his face grew pale. "Elena, where did you get this?" "I found it in my father's study after the funeral. He'd hidden it in his medical journal. Now read it aloud so Mr. Sawyer can hear what it says." Dr. Harrington cleared his throat and began to read in a voice that grew more strained with each word. "Dr. Whitmore, your recent inquiries into the activities of Harrison Medical Enterprises have been noted with concern. You are advised to discontinue this line of investigation immediately." Failure to comply will result in consequences that extend beyond your professional reputation to include the safety and well-being of your daughter. This is your final warning." Jeb felt the blood drain from his face. Harrison Enterprises, that's the same name on the survey map Rebecca Walsh showed us. Elena nodded grimly. The same criminal organization that's been stealing mining claims here has connections to a medical consortium back east. My father discovered they were using fake credentials to install unqualified doctors in territorial practices, then billing the government for services that were never provided. "But Elena," Dr. Harrington said desperately, "this letter could have come from anyone. It doesn't prove." "It proves that my father was murdered," Elena interrupted, "and it proves that you knew about it." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Dr. Harrington's composed facade cracked, and for the first time since his arrival, he looked genuinely afraid. "Elena, you don't understand the forces you're dealing with," he said quietly. "These people have resources and connections that reach into the highest levels of government. They can destroy careers, ruin lives, make people disappear without a trace. Like they made my father disappear." "Your father's death was supposed to look natural," Dr. Harrington said, and then immediately seemed to realize what he'd revealed. Jeb's hand moved to his gun without conscious thought. "You just confessed to murder." "No," Dr. Harrington said quickly. "I didn't kill him. I wasn't even in Boston when it happened. But I knew afterward. I knew what had really happened, and I knew Elena was in danger." "So you helped her escape," Jeb said, beginning to understand. "The mail-order bride scheme was my idea," Dr. Harrington admitted. "I thought if Elena disappeared into a new identity in some remote location, she'd be safe. The Harrison people would assume she'd died or given up her investigation." "But you sent her to Samuel Briggs," Elena said accusingly. "You sent her directly to the people you were supposedly protecting her from." Dr. Harrington's face crumpled with what appeared to be genuine anguish. "I didn't know. I swear to you, Elena, I had no idea that Briggs was connected to Harrison Enterprises. The plan was for you to marry a rancher named William Carson and live quietly as a frontier wife. When I learned that Carson was fictional and that Briggs had taken possession of you, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake." "How did you find out?" Jeb asked. "Because the Harrison people contacted me," Dr. Harrington said miserably. "They told me that Dr. Elena Whitmore had been located in Colorado Territory and was practicing medicine under her real name. They ordered me to come here and eliminate the problem." Elena went very still. "Eliminate the problem?" "They want you dead, Elena. They've decided that as long as you're alive, you're a threat to their operations. They sent me here to kill you and make it look like an accident." The confession seemed to exhaust Dr. Harrington completely. He sat heavily on a tree stump, his head in his hands. "But I can't do it," he said quietly. "I loved your father like a brother, and I love you like a daughter. I came here to warn you, not to harm you." "So what now?" Jeb asked, his mind racing through the implications of what they'd learned. "Now Elena has to disappear again," Dr. Harrington said. "Really disappear this time. Go somewhere so remote that even Harrison Enterprises can't find her." "I'm not running anymore," Elena said firmly. "These people killed my father. They've stolen land and mining claims from dozens of families, and they're using territorial medical licenses to commit fraud on a massive scale. Someone has to stop them." "It can't be you," Dr. Harrington pleaded. "Elena, you're just one person. They have lawyers, politicians, federal marshals on their payroll. You can't fight an organization like that." "Maybe she can't," Jeb said quietly, "but we can." Elena looked at him with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Jeb, you don't understand what you're saying. These people will kill you without hesitation." "Then we better make sure we get them before they get us," Jeb replied. Dr. Harrington stared at them both, as if they'd lost their minds. "You're talking about taking on one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. They have resources you can't even imagine. And we have something they don't," Elena said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We have the truth. We have evidence of their crimes. And we have people in this community who've been hurt by their activities and who deserve justice. Elena, please, Dr. Harrington said desperately. I'm begging you to reconsider. Let me help you disappear. I have money, connections, places where you could be safe. I'm safe here, Elena said, looking directly at Jeb. I'm safe with people who care more about doing what's right than doing what's profitable. Dr. Harrington followed her gaze and seemed to understand something that hadn't been clear to him before. You're in love with him? Yes, Elena said simply. I am. And I'm in love with her, Jeb added, the words feeling both natural and terrifying. Which means I'm not going to let anyone hurt her. Not Harassment Enterprises, not Samuel Briggs, and not you. Dr. Harrington nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this development. Then you're both going to die, and it will be my fault for not being able to protect you. The only fault would be in not trying to stop these people, Elena said. Jonathan, you have a choice. You can go back to Boston and tell them you completed your mission, that Dr. Elena Whitmore is dead. Or you can help us gather enough evidence to expose the entire conspiracy. If I help you, they'll kill me too. If you don't help us, you'll have to live with the knowledge that you let them win, Elena replied. Is that really the man you want to be? Dr. Harrington was quiet for a long time, staring at the letter that had started everything. Finally, he looked up with the expression of a man who'd made a difficult but necessary decision. What do you need me to do? Dr. Harrington's decision to help them fight Harassment Enterprises transformed everything about their situation. No longer were they simply a frontier doctor and a poor cowboy trying to resist local corruption. They now had an ally with intimate knowledge of their enemy's methods and resources. But that knowledge came with a terrible price, the understanding of just how powerful and ruthless their adversaries truly were. Over the next 3 days, they worked with careful precision to plan their strategy. Dr. Sisson's The Top 2. Harrington revealed that Harassment Enterprises operated through a network of seemingly legitimate businesses, using territorial medical licenses, mining claims, and land patents to create a web of legal cover for their criminal activities. The organization had been systematically looting the Western Territories for nearly 5 years, stealing millions of dollars in land and mineral rights while bribing officials to look the other way. The beauty of their system, Dr. Harrington explained as they huddled around Jeb's kitchen table, is that everything appears legal on the surface. They file proper paperwork, pay the required fees, and maintain excellent relationships with territorial officials. Anyone who challenges them looks like they're attacking legitimate businessmen. But we have evidence, Elena said, spreading out the documents they'd gathered. Rebecca Walsh's survey map, the original town charter, her father's threatening letter, and Dr. Harrington's own sworn statement about his mission to Colorado Territory. We have pieces of evidence, Dr. Harrington corrected gently. But Harassment Enterprises has teams of lawyers who specialize in making inconvenient evidence disappear. They'll claim the survey map is a forgery, the town charter is irrelevant to current territorial law, and that your father's letter could have been written by anyone. Then what do you suggest? Jeb asked, though he could see Elena's mind was already working through possibilities. We need something they can't dismiss or discredit, Elena said slowly. Something that proves their criminal intent beyond any reasonable doubt. Dr. Harrington nodded. What we need is documentation of their current operations, financial records, communication between their agents, proof of bribery or coercion. Something that shows the conspiracy in action. And where would we find such documentation? Jeb asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Briggs, Elena said simply. Samuel Briggs is their local representative. He has to keep records of his activities, report back to his superiors, coordinate with other agents in the network. So we need to search Briggs's office, Jeb concluded. We need to do more than search it, Dr. Harrington said grimly. We need to find documentation that proves the connection between Harassment Enterprises and the local corruption, then get that evidence to someone in territorial government who isn't on their payroll. And how do we know who we can trust? Elena asked. Dr. Harrington reached into his coat and withdrew a telegram. Before I left Boston, I made contact with a federal marshal named Thomas Bradley. He's been investigating Harassment Enterprises for months, trying to build a case against them. If we can get solid evidence to him, he can act on it. Elena read the telegram carefully. He's in Denver. That's at least a 3-day ride from here. Which means we need to move quickly, Dr. Harrington said. My employers expect me to report back within the week. When I don't, they'll send someone else to finish what I was supposed to do. Jeb felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he contemplated what they were planning. Breaking into Briggs's office would be dangerous enough, but stealing documents from a man who'd already committed multiple murders seemed like suicide. There's something else we need to consider, he said quietly. If we do this, if we steal evidence and send it to federal authorities, Briggs and his men aren't going to just sit quietly and wait to be arrested. They're going to come after us with everything they have. Which is why we need to be prepared to defend ourselves, Elena said matter-of-factly. Jeb stared at her. Elena, you're talking about a gunfight. These men are killers. And I'm talking about survival. Elena replied firmly. Jeb, they're going to try to kill us whether we fight back or not. At least this way, we have a chance to take them with us. Dr. Harrington looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Perhaps there's another way. If I return to Boston and report that you're dead, they'll send someone to verify. Elena interrupted. And when they discover I'm still alive, they'll send an army to finish the job. No, Jonathan. We have one chance to stop this, and we have to take it. The rest of that day was spent in detailed planning. Dr. Harrington drew them a map of the saloon's layout, based on his observations during his brief stay in town. Briggs kept an office on the second floor, accessible through a back staircase that led up from the alley behind the building. The office was where he conducted his private business, away from the noise and scrutiny of the saloon floor. He usually leaves around midnight. Dr. Harrington reported, goes to his cabin about a mile outside town, but he keeps 2 men posted downstairs at all times, and there are usually 3 or 4 customers who drink until the early morning hours. So we need a distraction, Jeb said. We need more than a distraction, Elena corrected. We need a way to clear the building entirely. As evening approached, Jeb found himself checking and rechecking his father's service revolver, the weight of the weapon feeling both familiar and foreign in his hands. His father had carried this gun during his younger days as a circuit preacher, when traveling the frontier meant being prepared for any kind of trouble. Thomas Sawyer had been a man of peace, but he'd also been practical about the realities of frontier life. You don't have to do this, Elena said, watching him clean the revolver with careful attention to each component. Dr. Harrington and I could... No, Jeb said firmly. We're in this together, remember. Besides, you'll need someone watching your back while you search for documents. Elena sat beside him on the narrow bed, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she'd begun making from wild plants. Jeb, I need you to understand something. If this goes wrong, if we don't make it through tonight, I want you to know that these past months have been the happiest of my life. He set down the revolver and turned to face her. Elena, we're going to make it through this. We're going to expose Harassment Enterprises, we're going to clear your father's name, and we're going to build a life together. How can you be so certain? Because I have faith, Jeb said simply. Faith in you, faith in us, and faith that sometimes good people can win against bad people if they're willing to fight hard enough. Elena leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close and breathing in the scent of her hair. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the promise of winter on its breath. Inside, the firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an intimate cocoon that felt removed from the dangers waiting for them in town. There's something I need to tell you, Elena said softly. Something about my father's death that I haven't shared with anyone. Jeb waited patiently, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal was important. The night before he died, my father gave me a key, Elena continued. He said it opened a safety deposit box in the Boston National Bank, and that if anything happened to him, I should retrieve what was inside. Did you? I tried, but the bank claimed they had no record of my father maintaining a safety deposit box. When I pressed them, they suggested I might be mistaken about the key's purpose. Elena reached into her medical bag and withdrew a small brass key that Jeb had never seen before. But I think my father knew he was going to be killed, and I think he hid evidence of Harassment Enterprises' crimes in that safety deposit box. Why didn't you tell me about this before? Because I didn't want to give you another reason to worry about my past, Elena admitted. But if we're going to risk our lives tonight, you deserve to know everything. Jeb examined the key carefully. It was ornately decorated with the initials EW and a serial number that had been partially filed away. Elena, what if the bank wasn't lying? What if your father didn't use the Boston National Bank? What do you mean? What if he opened the safety deposit box somewhere else, somewhere Harassment Enterprises wouldn't think to look? Elena's eyes widened as she understood his implication. You think he might have opened it here, in Colorado territory? I think a man who was smart enough to discover a criminal conspiracy might have been smart enough to hide evidence where the criminals couldn't find it. They spent the next hour discussing possibilities, but ultimately concluded that finding the safety deposit box would have to wait until after they dealt with the immediate threat. The evidence they needed was in Briggs's office, and tonight was their best chance to get it. As they prepared to leave for town, Dr. Harrington approached Jeb with obvious reluctance. Mr. Sawyer, there's something I need to say to you about Elena. Jeb waited, sensing that this was a conversation the doctor had been building up to. I want you to know that I never loved her the way a man should love the woman he plans to marry. Dr. Harrington said quietly. Our engagement was arranged by our families for business reasons. Elena deserved better than that, and she deserves better than what I put her through by sending her west. She's got better, Jeb said simply. Yes, I can see that, Dr. Harrington agreed. She's found someone who sees her for who she really is, not for what her family name and medical degree can do for his career. That's worth more than all the money and social position in Boston. Dr. Harrington, Jeb said carefully, are you planning to go back east after this is over? If we survive this, I'm planning to disappear entirely, Dr. Harrington replied. Harassment Enterprises will never forgive my betrayal, and I can never go back to the life I had before. But Elena can have a new life here with you, and that's all that matters to me. As they mounted their horses for the ride to town, Jeb found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he'd been a simple farmer, with no greater ambition than to make his land productive and perhaps find a good woman to share it with. Now he was preparing to risk everything in a fight against a criminal conspiracy that stretched across half the continent. But as he looked at Elena riding beside him, her medical bag replaced with a satchel for carrying stolen documents, he knew he wouldn't change anything about the path that had brought them to this moment. Some fights were worth having, and some people were worth dying for. Tonight, they would discover which category they fell into. The Dusty Rose Saloon stood silent in the moonlight, its windows glowing amber against the darkness of the November night. From their position in the alley behind the building, Jeb could hear the muffled sounds of conversation and occasional laughter from the customers inside. But the noise seemed distant and unreal, as if it belonged to a different world than the one he now inhabited. Elena crouched beside him, her breathing steady despite the obvious tension in her body. Dr. Harrington waited with the horses at the mouth of the alley, ready to signal if anyone approached from the street. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Elena would slip up the back stairs to Briggs's office, while Jeb kept watch, search for evidence of Harassment Enterprises' activities, and escape before anyone discovered what they were doing. Remember, Elena whispered, I need 15 minutes to search thoroughly. If anything goes wrong, don't try to be heroic. Just get out and warn Dr. Harrington. Elena, promise me, Jeb, these documents are important, but they're not worth your life. They're worth our lives, Jeb corrected quietly. If we don't stop these people tonight, we'll spend whatever time we have left looking over our shoulders. Elena squeezed his hand briefly, then moved toward the wooden staircase that led to the second floor. The stairs were old and poorly maintained, and every step seemed to echo in the still air despite her careful movements. Jeb watched until she disappeared through the door at the top, then turned his attention to the saloon's back exit. The first few minutes passed without incident. Jeb could hear Elena moving around above, opening drawers and file cabinets, with the methodical care of someone who understood the importance of leaving no trace of her search. The sounds from inside the saloon continued unchanged conversations, the clink of glasses, the occasional burst of laughter. Then something shifted in the atmosphere. The back door of the saloon opened, and one of Briggs' men stepped outside. He was a large, thick-set fellow that Jeb recognized but didn't know by name, and he seemed to be taking a break from whatever duties kept him inside. The man lit a cigarette and leaned against the building, close enough that Jeb could have reached out and touched him. Jeb pressed himself deeper into the shadows, barely daring to breathe. Above, Elena's movements had stopped entirely. She must have heard the man's footsteps. For several minutes that felt like hours, the three of them remained frozen in place. Elena hiding in Briggs's office, Jeb concealed in the alley, and the guard smoking his cigarette in blissful ignorance of the drama unfolding around him. Finally, the man finished his smoke and returned inside. Jeb heard Elena resume her search, and he allowed himself to hope that their luck would hold just a little longer. That hope was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Samuel Briggs and two of his men were riding hard toward the saloon, their faces grim with purpose. Even in the moonlight, Jeb could see that something had changed. Briggs looked like a man who'd received bad news and was eager to share his displeasure with others. Jeb whistled softly, a signal that he and Elena had arranged to indicate immediate danger. The searching sounds from above stopped instantly, but there was no way for Elena to escape now. Briggs and his men were already dismounting, and they would use the back stairs to reach the office. "Johnson," Briggs called to the guard inside, "get up to my office and make sure everything's secure. We've got problems, and I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Jeb's blood turned to ice. Elena was trapped in the office with nowhere to run, and Briggs's man would discover her in a matter of moments. Without conscious thought, Jeb stepped out of the shadows and into the moonlight. "Evening, Briggs," he said conversationally. "Lovely night for a ride." Briggs spun around, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "Sawyer, what the hell are you doing here?" "Just enjoying the evening air," Jeb replied, walking slowly toward the group of men. "Amazing how peaceful the town gets after dark." "You're lying," Briggs said flatly. "Nobody comes to the alley behind the saloon to enjoy evening air. You're here for a reason." "Maybe I am," Jeb agreed. "Maybe I've been thinking about our conversation the other day. The one where you offered Dr. Whitmore your protection in exchange for money." Briggs studied him carefully, clearly trying to determine if this was some kind of trap. "What about it?" "Well, I've been wondering exactly what kind of protection you think she needs, and what kind of threats you think she's facing." "I think she's facing the kind of threats that come from asking too many questions about things that don't concern her," Briggs said with a cold smile. "Things like mineral rights and land patents." The change in Briggs's expression was immediate and deadly. "What do you know about mineral rights?" "I know that Harassment Enterprises has been filing false claims throughout the territory," Jeb said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I know they've been stealing land from honest people and bribing officials to look the other way." Briggs drew his gun in one smooth motion, the barrel pointing directly at Jeb's chest. "You know too much, Sawyer. I know that you killed Michael Walsh because he found evidence of your crimes," Jeb continued, ignoring the weapon aimed at his heart. "I know that you're working with corrupt officials to steal millions of dollars in property rights. And I know that you're about to join Walsh in whatever hole they dumped his body," Briggs replied. Above them, Jeb heard the sound of a window opening. Elena's voice rang out clear and strong in the night air. "I have the evidence," she called. "Financial records, correspondence with Harassment Enterprises, documentation of bribes paid to territorial officials, all of it." Briggs looked up at the office window where Elena was visible in the lamplight, her medical bag replaced by a leather satchel stuffed with papers. "Dr. Elena Whitmore," he said with mock courtesy, "you just made the last mistake of your life." What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity that comes when life and death hang in the balance. Briggs kept his gun trained on Jeb while shouting orders to his men, but before anyone could move, the sound of galloping horses echoed from the main street. Dr. Harrington's voice cut through the night air with desperate urgency. Federal marshals approaching from the east. The announcement transformed everything. Briggs spun toward the sound of approaching riders, his face twisting with rage and something that looked like panic. Elena used the distraction to swing down from the office window, landing hard but keeping hold of the crucial satchel of evidence. "Kill them both!" Briggs screamed to his men. "Kill them now!" But his men were already looking toward the street, where the sound of horses was growing louder. In the confusion, Elena reached Jeb's side, and together they dove for cover behind a pile of empty barrels just as gunfire erupted around them. The newcomers weren't federal marshals at all, they were more of Briggs's men, arriving for some pre-arranged meeting. But Dr. Harrington's deception had created just enough chaos to give Elena and Jeb a fighting chance. "This way," Elena whispered, pulling Jeb toward a gap between buildings that led to the side street. They ran through the narrow passage, the satchel of evidence clutched against Elena's chest, while behind them Briggs realized he'd been fooled and roared orders for pursuit. The sound of running feet echoed off the buildings around them, and Jeb knew they had only moments before their enemies would catch up. "The church," Elena gasped as they reached the side street. "If we can reach the church." "Too far," Jeb said, looking back to see dark figures emerging from the alley. "We need cover now." Without hesitation, he kicked open the door of Murphy's General Store, grateful that the shopkeeper had never been careful about locks. They tumbled inside, just as the first of Briggs' men reached the street, and Jeb barricaded the door with a heavy display case. "Elena, are you hurt?" he asked, checking her for injuries in the dim light filtering through the store windows. "I'm fine," she said, though he could hear the strain in her voice. "But Jeb, this evidence, it's everything we hoped for and more. Financial records showing payments to territorial officials, correspondence between Briggs and Harrison Enterprises, documentation of at least 24 fraudulent land claims, including Michael Walsh's murder, including orders from Harrison Enterprises to eliminate any threats to the operation," Elena confirmed grimly. "This is enough to destroy them completely." Outside, they could hear Briggs organizing his men for a systematic search of the town. It was only a matter of time before they checked the general store, and when they did, there would be nowhere left to run. "Elena," Jeb said quietly, "I want you to take the evidence and go. Find Dr. Harrington, get to Denver, contact that federal marshal." "I'm not leaving you," Elena interrupted firmly. "You have to. This evidence is the only chance we have to stop Harrison Enterprises. If they capture both of us, we die together," Elena said simply. "I'm not running anymore, Jeb. I'm not leaving the man I love to face these monsters alone." Before Jeb could argue further, the sound of breaking glass echoed from the back of the store. Briggs's men had found another way in, and they would be inside within moments. Jeb drew his father's revolver, the weight of it steady and familiar in his hand. "Then we make our stand here." "Together," Elena agreed, reaching into the evidence satchel and withdrawing a small derringer that Jeb had never seen before. "My father gave me this before he died. He said a woman in medicine never knew when she might need to defend herself." The back door of the store burst open, and 2 of Briggs' men rushed inside with guns drawn. Jeb's first shot took down the lead man, while Elena's derringer barked once and sent the second man stumbling backward with a cry of pain. "Nicely done, Doc," Jeb said with genuine admiration. "Medical school doesn't teach marksmanship, but my father did," Elena replied, reloading with practiced efficiency. More men were coming. They could hear Briggs shouting orders and the sound of boots on wooden floors. But they'd proven they could fight, and more importantly, they'd proven they could fight together. "Whatever happens next," Elena said as they prepared for another assault, "I want you to know that saving me was the best thing you ever did." "Meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me," Jeb replied. Everything else is just details. The front door of the store exploded inward as Briggs himself kicked it down, his face twisted with murderous rage. Behind him, half a dozen armed men spread out to surround the store. "Dr. Elena Whitmore," Briggs called out, his voice echoing in the confined space. "You and your boyfriend have caused me more trouble than anyone has in years. But it ends tonight." "You're right," came a new voice from the street outside. "It does end tonight." The voice belonged to a tall man, wearing a federal marshal's badge, and he wasn't alone. 6 uniformed lawmen had taken positions around the store, their rifles trained on Briggs and his men. "Samuel Briggs," the marshal announced, "you're under arrest for murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." Dr. Harrington had found the real federal marshals. 3 months later, on a crisp February morning that sparkled with fresh snow, the bells of Clearwater Pass's little church rang out across the valley in celebration. Elena Whitmore, soon to be Elena Sawyer, stood before the mirror in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, adjusting the simple white dress that Sarah Henderson had sewn for her wedding day. It was nothing like the elaborate gown she might have worn for a Boston society wedding, but it was infinitely more beautiful because it represented something real and chosen rather than arranged. "You look radiant, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, pinning a spray of winter flowers into Elena's dark hair. "Jeb's a lucky man." "I'm the lucky one," Elena replied, meaning every word. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Now I'm about to marry the finest man I've ever known and start a new life in a community that's become my home." The trials of Samuel Briggs and his associates had dominated territorial headlines for weeks. The evidence Elena had stolen from his office, combined with testimony from victims throughout the region, had exposed the full scope of Harassment Enterprises' criminal activities. Federal marshals had made arrests in 3 territories and 2 states, effectively dismantling an organization that had stolen millions of dollars in land and mineral rights. Dr. Jonathan Harrington had proven to be a crucial witness for the prosecution, his insider knowledge of Harassment Enterprises' methods providing the final pieces needed to secure convictions. As he'd predicted, his cooperation had made it impossible for him to return to his old life, but he'd found purpose in helping other victims of the conspiracy seek justice and restitution. Samuel Briggs himself had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, while Claude Morrison and several other local conspirators faced shorter sentences for their roles in the land fraud scheme. The territorial government had moved quickly to restore legitimate ownership to stolen properties, and families like the Walshes were finally receiving compensation for their losses. Elena's medical practice had flourished beyond her wildest dreams. Word of her skills had spread throughout the territory, and she now saw patients who traveled hundreds of miles to consult with the woman doctor who'd stood up to corruption and lived to tell about it. She'd established the territory's first clinic specifically for women's health concerns, and had begun training other women in basic medical techniques. The federal government had officially recognized her medical credentials, making her the first licensed female physician in Colorado Territory. But more importantly to Elena, she'd found a place where her skills were valued and her calling could flourish without the constraints of social prejudice or professional jealousy. Jeb's life had transformed just as dramatically. The false debt claims against his property had been exposed as fraudulent, and he'd received an official apology from the territorial government, along with a small compensation payment for the harassment he'd endured. He'd used the money to expand his cabin into a proper home with space for Elena's medical practice, creating the territory's first combined residence and clinic. But the greatest change in Jeb's life wasn't material, it was the sense of purpose and partnership he'd found with Elena. Together, they'd built something that neither could have achieved alone, a life of service and meaning that honored both their individual callings and their shared commitment to helping others. As Elena made her final preparations for the wedding ceremony, she reflected on the mystery that had brought her to this moment. Her father's safety deposit box key had ultimately led to a bank in Denver, where Thomas Whitmore had indeed hidden crucial evidence of Harassment Enterprises' crimes. The additional documentation had helped secure convictions and had provided Elena with a substantial inheritance that her father had somehow managed to hide from his killers. But the real treasure had been the letter her father had left for her in the safety deposit boxer, final message that had brought her to tears when she'd read it. "My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, then the forces I've been fighting have succeeded in silencing me. But I want you to know that your safety and happiness matter more to me than any criminal conspiracy. Find somewhere safe, find someone who sees your worth, and build the life you deserve. The world needs doctors like you, my daughter, but it needs happy people even more. Choose happiness, wherever it leads you." Elena had chosen happiness, and it had led her to a simple cabin in Colorado Territory, to a man whose kindness matched her father's, and to a community that had embraced her despite the dangers she'd brought to their door. The church bells continued to ring as Elena made her way to the ceremony, accompanied by Mrs. Patterson and Sarah Henderson. The little church was packed with people whose lives she'd touched over the past months, patients she'd treated, families she'd helped, friends who'd supported her through the darkest days of the confrontation with Briggs. Jeb waited at the altar wearing his best suit and a smile that could have lit the entire territory. Beside him stood Dr. Harrington, who'd asked for the honor of serving as best man, a request that had surprised Elena but pleased her greatly. It seemed fitting that the man who'd helped orchestrate her escape from one life should witness her entry into another. As Elena walked down the aisle, she caught sight of the simple gold bands that waited on the altar rings crafted by the local blacksmith from Colorado Gold, representing the honest work and authentic love that had brought her and Jeb together. They were nothing like the elaborate jewelry she might have worn in Boston, but they were infinitely more precious because they symbolized a choice freely made rather than an obligation imposed. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt, conducted by the circuit preacher who'd known Jeb's father and who spoke movingly about the mysterious ways that brought people together at exactly the right moment. When Jeb slipped the wedding ring onto Elena's finger, she felt the final piece of her new life click into place. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced, and Jeb did so with a tenderness that brought tears to Elena's eyes. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Elena caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd, Rebecca Walsh, holding her healthy son Timothy and beaming with joy. The sight reminded Elena of how much had changed since that desperate night when she'd first treated the little boy, how many lives had been touched by the choice to fight rather than flee. Later, at the celebration that followed, Elena and Jeb stepped outside for a moment of quiet under the stars. The same mountains that had seemed so forbidding when she'd first arrived now felt like protective walls around their valley, sheltering a community that had learned to value courage over comfort and justice over convenience. "Any regrets?" Jeb asked, wrapping his arms around his new wife. "Only that it took so long for me to find you," Elena replied, leaning back against his chest and watching the stars wheel overhead. "We found each other exactly when we were supposed to," Jeb said with the quiet certainty that was one of the things she loved most about him. Everything that happened before was just preparation for this moment. Elena smiled, thinking of her father's letter and his advice to choose happiness. She'd chosen it, and it had chosen her back, bringing her to this place and this man and this life that felt like the answer to prayers she hadn't even known she was praying. Sometimes a single act of kindness really could change two lives forever. Sometimes the person you saved really did become the one who saved you. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, love grew stronger than any lie.